Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, look, Gensler should have been subpoenaed already. I mean, I think the amount of patience that Chairman McHenry's shown, I mean, maybe that's why he's the chairman. He's like more patient, studied, kind of working it, more diplomatic. Like, yeah, I think the subpoena was due like in February.
This content is brought to you by Link2, which makes private equity investment easy. Link2 is a great platform that allows you to get equity in companies before they go public, before they do an IPO. Within their portfolio includes crypto companies, AI companies, and fintech companies. Some of the crypto companies you may recognize include Circle, Ripple, Chainalysis, Ledger, Dapper Labs, and many more. If you'd like to learn more about Link2, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Congressman Warren Davidson, who's a Republican out of Ohio. Congressman Davidson, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, it's an honor to join you. Thanks.
Yeah, Congressman Davidson, I've followed you for years and all the great work you've done with legislation around crypto. I think you were, was maybe the first, as far as I remember, going back to the token taxonomy days and things like that. But before we get to all that, tell us about yourself, where you're from and where'd you grow up?
Yeah, so I grew up in Ohio, a little north of where I live now. So graduated high school in the 80s, 88, enlisted in the Army, and got sent over to Germany when the Berlin Wall was up. The Cold War was there, and the wall separating the East and the West went through East Berlin, and got to be there when that came down. And I'll just say, like, the people on the other side weren't looking for more government. They were looking for more freedom. And it was definitely a life-defining experience. From there, I got to go to West Point, which that's not the normal way you go to West Point, but it worked for me. And graduated, went back into the infantry, served in Ranger Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, the Old Guard, so some great units, but ultimately decided I needed to get out and go into business. So my wife and I and two little kids at that point in time moved back to Ohio and started manufacturing companies, went to Notre Dame, got an MBA, and we basically had a little group of manufacturing companies, and that was what I was doing. And John Boehner resigned as Speaker of the House, and a couple friends stopped in and said, hey, who are you going to back in the race? And I said, hey, you guys are the political people. And they cracked really a joke. They go, it'd be great if there was an Army Ranger business guy in the race. So we just laughed. And I went home and told my wife about my day. And she said, well, what'd you tell them? I'm like, well, we just laughed because it's crazy. And she said, no, it's not. You'd be great at that. Well, here I am. So that's been like, over 7 years ago now. So it's pretty crazy. So in Congress, I got here, and very few people knew much of it. Very few elected office holders knew much about crypto. And I was new on the Financial Services Committee, and kind of started that kind of Army Ranger business guy, financial services, also on foreign affairs. And it's been an interesting time to be in politics, right?
Oh yeah. Well, first, thank you for your service, and it sounds like that was just an incredible experience you had with the Berlin Wall and so forth, and being over there. That must have been something life-changing, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah. And look, I mean, the military offers a great opportunity for so many people. I mean, it's not a perfect fit for everybody. For me, I just love that I got to be a part of it, and it turned out phenomenally well for me. But it really is a great thing to do. And, a lot of phenomenal people that go in and give a portion of their lives in service. And then unfortunately, frankly, some of my friends and others, they give their full life, lost in combat or, occasionally a training accident or something. But, it's a serious commitment, but it is really cool that I had the chance to do it.
Wow. So let's talk about some of the work you've done on the crypto legislation front, because I remember, as far as I can remember, the Token Taxonomy Act being maybe the first crypto legislation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but tell us about the history of the different bills and things you worked on.
Yeah, so when I first got to the committee, it was January of 2017, and you remember 2017 was like the ICO market. People like, oh, I could just write a white paper and kind of skip everything. And there were really good use cases, people trying to do things honestly. And then unfortunately, there were just some outright pump and dump scams where people were being taken advantage of. And I'm like, where's the SEC? You should be cracking down on these scammers. And, they weren't really, reacting well. They didn't really know who was going to do what. So there was this void. And, I was trying to get hearings on this subject. And, as the new guy, you don't get to choose which hearing. So this goes all the way into 2018. And we really couldn't get focused as a committee on the issue. So I was like, well, I can at least have a meeting. We won't be able to call it a hearing, so we'll have a meeting. And we did this thing at the Library of Congress, and it started out with a goal of getting about a dozen people together. And by the end, we had to cap it at 50. And like people were like, oh, I want to send my CEO and I want to send my general counsel. And we had some of the biggest names in not just crypto, but venture capital. The New York Stock Exchange, Fidelity, State Street. I mean, you name it, Andreessen Horowitz, you name it, the big players. We also are like, look, we got to have some startup companies and some founders that no one's ever even heard of. Some of those kind of no one still has heard of. They kind of went away. But a lot of them have really turned into some of the biggest names in crypto over time. And it was just an interesting conversation. So the goal was just listen to everybody and say, well, if we're looking at a tree, how far up can we go before everybody's interest starts diverging and branching out in a different way? And we want to kind of go up to that first level of branches and say, this is the consensus. If you solve these things, you could provide a really difference-making piece of legislation. So that was the Token Taxonomy Act. Darren Soto, a Democrat from Florida, and I led the bill. And man, think how different crypto would be if we had passed that bill in like 2018. We would have defined a bright line test to kind of modernize like what is and is not a security if it's a digital asset and tokenized. If it meets this criteria, it falls, it's a security. You got to go talk to the SEC. If not, you can raise capital and move forward with confidence that the regulators aren't going to come in and kill your whole business model. And gosh, have they done that in spades? So custody is largely being solved by technology, but we see the problem with the infrastructure bill that kind of came in with some definitions there. And we still don't really have a good definition for tax. And the EU kind of moved forward with that with the de minimis exception, 2,000 euros. And in the US, our baseline is $600 for normal currency transactions. And we should probably update that in general. But fundamentally, we don't have clarity for digital assets and the de minimis exception in any case.
Yeah. And, Congressman Davidson, back then, 2017, I don't think a lot of people took crypto and blockchain seriously. Now they are. Some of the biggest names are getting involved, BlackRock and some other big names. And this is turning out to be a global asset class, the next layer on top of the internet. And it seems like in the United States, going back to your point, if they had gotten like a bill that you put forward, like a Token Taxonomy Act, pass and got it, going and get the infrastructure set up for regulating it, we would be much further ahead. But it seems like other countries are now leading. Is the U.S. in danger of losing out here, or do we have some time to catch up?
Well, I think we've already missed out a lot. I mean, and look at some of the fraud cases that kind of set the industry back. And that's the other part is if you had, a perfect example, Gary Gensler has highlighted a problem. There's a structural issue at the SEC. But there's also, of course, a Gary Gensler issue. And you can highlight both of them by he reaches a $1.5 million settlement with Kim Kardashian, grabs a headline because she was promoting an unregistered security. But if that was actually a coherent approach by the Securities and Exchange Commission, then you would go after Ethereum Max, which is the alleged security that she was promoting. You haven't gone after Ethereum Max, the people that operate the foundation. You haven't gone after anybody that trades, on a platform, Ethereum Max. You just did this weird kind of hodgepodge of regulation by enforcement. But meanwhile, they missed Luna, Celsius, FTX. You name it. Like, where are the regulators? And Gary Gensler, if you listen to him, everything's within his domain. Well, then great. Why didn't you address any of the real problems?
Right.
And so I think we could have really done a lot if we had a law. And it's disappointing that it hasn't happened, but that's not an excuse for it to continue to fail to happen. And thankfully, in July, the House Financial Services Committee finally moved, a market structure bill that kind of solves some of the baseline issues and a handful of other ones. We also dealt with stable coins, and we also protected self-custody. So there's some really good laws that passed here in July. The House Financial Services Committee, not even the full House yet. So we're working to get the full legislative process. So, for people that don't really follow Congress, it's like, well, so what really happened? Well, we have all these committees in Congress. The first thing you do is move something through a committee normally, and then you bring it to the full House for a vote, subject to amendment normally. And then if the Senate passes the same version, then it can go to the White House for a signature by the president, and it can become law. And so, safe to say, there's still some work underway to kind of get this across the finish line.
Yeah, I was very happy to see the market structure bill as well as stablecoin bill be marked up. And like you said, within the communities, getting the approvals and so forth, and it has to go to vote. So question for you, when is and I don't know if you have a date for this yet, when is the set date for the voting for the full House on those bills?
Yeah, there's not a set date. So it really is kind of collaboration. And, right now, as you and I are speaking, the House is in the final days of the 2023 fiscal year. The government's only funded till September 30th. And
Right.
we have, truly hours left to come up with a funding proposal, or there will be a government shutdown. And so really, pretty much the only thing moving is directly related to funding right now.
Yeah.
Once we get through that fight, people will kind of come up for air and say, all right, what do we have available that we could move? And how do we build that into the agenda? So hopefully here in the fall, that's something that we can work together on. And it was nice that it was a bipartisan effort, and that certainly helps.
Yeah, I was really happy to see that too. And I think a lot of folks who have been paying attention, happy to see you and your colleagues across the aisle have been working together on this. And that it's, not a partisan issue, but it's a United States issue. We need to get the jobs here, keep the capital here, and get things moving, because our competitors overseas, EU, UK, these folks have already passed some legislation. A hard question for you. So let's say it's voted in the House. I don't think there's going to be any roadblocks here. I could see the bills making it through the House. How likely is it to get through the Senate? Because I know the Senate's very tough.
Yeah, the Senate's always, historically in political science, mastering the Senate is the challenge. The House passes roughly 3 or 4 bills for every bill that the Senate moves. So they tend to move fewer bills. And, part of that's by design, but part of it is they're just not very productive. I mean, if you look at the Senate Banking Committee, Sherrod Brown, who's one of my state's senators from Ohio, they just moved the first bill through their committee on any subject since 2017. I mean, they haven't even marked up a bill that made it through the Senate Banking Committee since 2017. This is 2023. So, let that sink in. 5.5 years between bills moving through. So you're like, what in the world are you guys doing? And, they do nominations and confirmations and go back. Remember that Sherrod Brown was trying to get the communist banker lady for the OCC confirmed, and they had to have a do-over. So they wasted time on a lot of things. But hopefully this is one of those things that they can get done too, because in the Senate, although I don't like their version of the bill, Senator Lummis and Senator Gillibrand have a bipartisan piece of legislation that they've worked together on that hopefully Senator Schumer likes, because Senator Gillibrand from New York kind of has addressed it. And if you look in the space, New York has provided some of the, maybe not necessarily the best legislation, but they're one of the states that has provided some legal clarity in the space. And so it offers some hope for a path.
Hmm. Let's go back to the SEC, because a lot of folks are frustrated with the SEC and Gary Gensler, and even the commissioners, are butting heads. SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, Mark Ueda, they often dissent from the decisions made by the agency. And it seems like Gary Gensler has made the SEC very political. He doesn't seem to be a neutral party, just looking at things holistically. So you introduced a SEC Stabilization Act. Tell us about that, and how can folks support you with that?
Yeah, so the goal is to depoliticize the SEC. I mean, right now you have a strong commissioner, the chair or strong chairman. Gary Gensler's the chairman. If people don't know, Elizabeth Warren kind of dominates the appointment process for Democrats. So if because of the confirmation process in the Senate, if her people don't get picked, then she's like, nah, I don't really support that nomination. And she's really built a lot of power over who is nominated to anything related to financial services within Democrat administrations. And, for that reason, Gary Gensler, tight relationship with Elizabeth Warren, and she's anti-crypto. So Gary Gensler's anti-crypto. And if he wasn't, he wouldn't have been the SEC chairman. So they've got kind of this war on crypto going. Everyone kind of knows it. This is known as Operation Choke Point. Barney Frank, Democrat member from Massachusetts, member of Congress for a long time, was chairman of the Financial Services Committee. And, Barney Frank of the Dodd-Frank bill that really overhauled banking after the 08-09 financial crisis. So he's out there saying there's a war against crypto. So it's not like a partisan attack against Elizabeth Warren. Within the Democratic Party, they're divided, but the anti-crypto faction is the party that's holding the seats of power. And that would be, Elizabeth Warren and Gary Gensler right now. If you look in our committee, Maxine Waters, the former chairwoman, now ranking member of the committee, and Brad Sherman are some of the strongest anti-crypto voices. But thankfully, Democrats broadly support crypto. I mean, if you go look outside of Congress, your average person in the industry is probably left of center, maybe even left of the Democratic Party. And they're like, where in the world are my representatives? And, kudos to Richie Torres and, Jake Auchincloss and Eli Nickel or Wiley Nickel, and some others for getting on board with a good piece of legislation.
Yeah. And so the SEC Stabilization Act, I know it removes the chair seat, and there's an additional commissioner, and then there's an executive director, which reports to a board. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the strong chairman that's kind of become an activist, what's the remedy? Well, you eliminate the chairmanship. And so right now there are 5 commissioners, one of whom is the chairman, and kind of has superpowers. The reality is you would turn it into a peer relationship where there's 6 commissioners and no more than 3 can be with any one political party. So essentially it would be a 3-and-3 system. And there would have to be more collaboration. I mean, that's the sense. If it's a kind of no-brainer decision, then then great. It'll be unanimous, or somebody from the other party will kind of cross over. And in that sense, it kind of takes the kind of polarizing political issues off the table because they won't be able to have the votes. And the upside of that is it pushes the 50-50 issues. Instead of having a powerful chairman to just decide, it pushes those 50-50 issues back to Congress and kind of makes us do our job and pass laws.
And, how can that bill, well, you haven't introduced it. How can folks who are watching and listening to this be able to support you on that? Is it contacting your representatives to help bring light to that bill and voice their concerns?
Yeah, I think, reach out to your representative, ask them to consider co-sponsoring it. We would love to get a Democrat member to co-sponsor it. Right now, a lot of Democrats have said, I agree with it, but it's always touchy to go after someone in a Democrat administration when you're a Democrat, or vice versa. If, Republicans didn't do the greatest job pushing back on the Republican administration either. But I think those kinds of things are really important because the founders kind of spoke out against political parties as they were forming the country and spoke about the importance of a separation of powers where Congress has its lane and its powers, and the executive branch has its powers. The system doesn't really work that way anymore, but it should more often. And I think if we did do that, we could do something common sense. I mean, we have the best capital markets in the world. I mean, we get like less than 5% of the world's population. We get about 25% of the world's GDP. And we have over 50% of the world's invested capital in capital markets. I mean, and that's true broadly. It's not true in crypto. I mean, you have like 75% of the liquidity in crypto is offshore. Like, if we just get our act together, look at the difference that could make for American capital formation. And when you look at the baseline, like, why would you mess this up? Like, you have 50% of the world's invested capital. Like, just don't mess it up. And, and then we have Gary Gensler working to mess it up.
So speaking of Gary Gensler, obviously we had the hearing yesterday, which you were a part of. And, one of the things that Patrick McHenry brought up was, I don't want to send a subpoena to you, but I'm going to have to if I don't get the documents, the communications, and Gary Gensler in his office working with the members of the committee. So hard question for you, because this is coming in from everybody. Is that the next step? Indeed. There's obviously.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, look, Gensler should have been subpoenaed already. I mean, I think the amount of patience that Chairman McHenry's shown, I mean, maybe that's why he's the chairman. He's like more patient, study, kind of working it, more diplomatic. Like, yeah, I think the subpoena was due like in February. Like, we sent you a question in January. You totally blew us off. Here's a subpoena. And,
right.
He's really totally, I mean, like I said, he's front running in Congress. He's front running the administration. I mean, there are people in the administration that reach out and say, well, he's really, he's a problem. But unfortunately, they're not. I mean, there are some people in the administration, not necessarily the majority, but the people with the power and influence over the agenda love the agenda Gary Gensler is doing. And, they just, delight themselves, just like Gary Gensler, being questioned aggressively by members of Congress is like a badge of honor for these folks, and they look at it as like, oh, that's great. I love that we're pushing your buttons. And it's like, no, you're wrecking the markets for American capital markets. And, I thought my colleague Andy Barr had one of the best comments during the hearing. Gary Gensler said, even Olympians have to train to stay on top and to stay the best. So we should do that for our capital markets. And Barr rebutted him and said, if America's capital markets are like the Olympics and the Olympians, you're like the Tanya Harding of the Olympics, kneecapping our capital markets. And, for people that don't get that dated reference, Tanya Harding assaulted the person that was going to go ahead of her in the Olympics and struck her in the knee, basically trying to wreck her gold medal hopes over not being able to beat her. So it was a pretty good comparison to kind of the way Gary Gensler is going about it.
And do the decisions by the courts in the Grayscale and the Ripple lawsuit, possibly soon in Coinbase, do those decisions help to reduce the power or the influence of those folks you mentioned that are behind Gary Gensler who have that level of power?
I hope it kind of takes away their patience. It's like, yeah, we've tolerated this for a while, but it is time to move on. I don't know, but it's strong language for a court to say that something was arbitrary and capricious, and for the layperson, those are just regular words. But that's like the essential, like screaming all caps profanity at somebody from the courts. They're like, this is BS, basically, is there in legal jargon speak, and so it is a pretty big brushback to the SEC to have that kind of language come from the courts. But, Gary Gensler's thing is, well, the courts, whatever. So, on the one hand, he holds up the Howey test as like everything. And look, to me, that's like a Jackson Pollock painting. I mean, it might be admirable, but you can make it mean all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And, we need a law really that ratifies the Howey test for everything, but we certainly do for digital assets. And I thought Richie Torres, a Democrat from New York, did a great job highlighting, like, if there's a contract, if you say there's an investment contract, where's the contract? Right. Find a court case where there was a contract without a contract.
Mhm.
So Gary Gensler is trying to say everything's an investment contract, and he's like, well, where's the contract?
Right.
And that's not what the case law says.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the example you brought up about the Pokemon cards too, because a lot of people can relate to that. And there was obviously the SEC settlement with Stoner Cat's NFTs recently. So we need clarity. It's much needed. I know we're running up on time, so I got a few more questions for you. I personally hold Ethereum. I stake Ethereum, and I, certainly believe in it as a project. But there are folks who are concerned about what took place with Ethereum and the SEC, and I think it's more so on the SEC side, and that is with Bill Hinman. Some of this information was released via the Ripple lawsuit as well as FOIA requests from a nonprofit organization. So, I don't know if this is anything that will be relevant to what's happening with Gary Gensler now, but maybe it's your SEC Stabilization Act that will prevent things like this from happening, because there were, ethics warnings to Bill Hinman, like, hey, you can't talk to these people. They're connected to Ethereum. And then he gives a speech that Ethereum is not a security. I would love to get your thoughts on that, because I know there's been a lot of back and forth on Twitter on it.
Yeah. So I don't own Ethereum. I never have owned Ethereum. And just like a lot of people, when I saw the Bill Hinman speech, I took it as guidance. I think I made a reference to that in a hearing back at the time.
Right.
I was like, oh, it's a sign of hope. You've got some guidance coming out of the SEC. And now they're saying, well, no, that was his personal opinion. It wasn't guidance. And, they always issue these statements up front in their speeches, shouldn't be taken as guidance. You're like, okay. But then when you dig into it, it's like, oh no, he was sending messages back and forth with, and I asked the enforcement director, Grewal, about this. And it's like, look, if you had messages back and forth with ethics, would it still be an official position? I mean, and so it seems like it was vetted. He put it out. Now, to be clear, ethics was telling him don't do it, and he did it anyway. So, I do think there should be, more accountability for those kinds of things. But that's kind of what I was getting at with the follow up after the Grayscale ETF. Part of the concern was it was arbitrary and capricious to dismiss previous efforts to create a Bitcoin spot ETF. And people are concerned that it'll also be arbitrary and capricious to say, oh no, you're going to the back of the line. These people are coming to the front line. You've got people that have literally been trying for a decade
Right.
to work with the SEC to get a Bitcoin ETF out there. Think of how much scale a company could have been, built over that time frame. And now for somebody else like, BlackRock, who's one of the latest entrants, to come in and just jump to the front of the line. I think people will rightly be pretty upset if that happens to be the way it works out. And it looks like, people have referred to Ethereum as the Ethereum free pass. Like they got their free pass, but then everybody else, the market's closed, can't do it. Right. And that's been the case that a lot of Ripple XRP people have made in particular. And the fear is that you'll see the same kind of thing. So that's what I was alluding to. Is there going to be like a free pass for someone for a Bitcoin spot ETF, when the reality is lots of people have made the same kind of application?
Yeah. And I guess, Mike, it goes back to maybe it's something like the SEC Stabilization Act to fix this, because I know it's a bit of a symptom of big government and bureaucrats and getting too much power and so forth. And in the back of my mind, I don't want to get too philosophical. I'm like, how do we fix things like this? Because I know it's not just the SEC. There's other agencies in the government that have problems like this.
Yeah, and I think, look, the founders cautioned about partisanship. The reality is, it didn't last long before you had political parties. Thomas Jefferson and then John Adams ran in political parties. President 2 and 3. So it didn't take long because human nature, and they recognized human nature. We're sinful people, right? So human nature is going to come in, and I mean that's one of the things that I like about Lord of the Rings. If no one's read or watched the movie Lord of the Rings, there's this ring of power. It's just a gold wedding band, and it's got an inscription on the inside. And it's all power. It's like one ring to rule them all. And frankly, I use that analogy to talk about central bank digital currencies. And yeah, it could be more efficient, but it's evil. And everywhere you see dystopian futures, whether it's what I consider scripture, the book of Revelation, or 1984, Brave New World, you pick your dystopian future, and they've always corrupted money from its proper use as a store of value and means of exchange into some sort of tool for coercion and control, because eventually there's somebody whose nature uses that power. And, there's a saying, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's kind of the flaw in the SEC's structure, is you've got a super powerful chairman that is effectively not accountable to anyone.
On the note of CBDCs, obviously many central banks around the world are building this. So is the U.S. almost, it's kind of like this is inevitable, but we have to put the guardrails around it. I know there are folks who are saying, hey, no CBDC at all, but in the global competition, right? How do we stay competitive if the rest of the world is doing this? And is it?
Yeah, the way we stay competitive is we don't do a CBDC, because who wants to have a government use a tool for coercion and control over them? The strongest, hardest money usually wins. And the way to make the dollar stronger and harder is to make it more sound, not less sound. So I don't care if we're the last country in the world not on a central bank digital currency. We should never use a central bank digital currency. To use another movie analogy, I've compared it to, the Federal Reserve being allowed to build one and promise not to turn it on. It's like letting the Empire build the Death Star from Star Wars. And they're like, oh, but we won't turn it on. We're just going to test it on this planet over here.
Would a stable coin be ideal, like USDC that's in the market already? Would that be better than a CBDC, or is it? Do you see it?
Absolutely, and even beyond that, there are other things that to me make more sense than a stable coin that's backed by treasuries, because treasuries are really backed by fiat money. So I think harder money is better. So if you look at a commodity-backed stablecoin where there's an ounce of gold for each token, and the value is an ounce of gold, roughly. To me, that's a better system. But anything that says that you can't just turn the money printer on, like the Federal Reserve has done for the dollar, we were spending more money than anyone would even lend us. At least the Treasury represents a promise of somebody that is staking the debt. The trouble is that 5 trillion of those treasuries, or nearly 9 trillion of the treasuries, if you add them all up, are held by the Federal Reserve. It's just poof money that no one would even lend us. So it really is a moral hazard to go down kind of the unbacked money. And you could even say, well, but if it's credible and someone will really lend against it, it's there. But there's a huge portion of it that no one is even lending us.
I wish we had another hour to talk about that, but I'm going to hit you with a wrap-up question here. Rapid fire. Favorite food?
Steak.
Favorite musician or band?
Oh gosh, favorite musician or band? That's tough. I'd say right now my favorite song is This Richmond North of Richmond, and I'm in the office that probably is getting trashed by that song. But I love so many of the lines from it. It's like, they just want to control you. They want to control what you think, control what you do. And I got colleagues that's definitely true of, and I'm working on privacy like crazy. Your dollar ain't shit. I just talked about destroying the value of your dollar. Right. And the line that really resonates for me with that song is, I wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. And it's like that on so many things. I mean, and to me, kind of part of the sentiment is, and the frustration that Oliver Anthony's the musician, that he had behind it was, these guys are using my own country to destroy, they're using my government to destroy my country. And that really just grates at people. And I think that's why it resonated so much with people, including me.
For sure. Yeah. Favorite movie?
Saving Private Ryan.
It's a great movie. Favorite book?
The Bible. I mean, kind of a catch answer, but it's the operator manual for humans.
And when you're not doing your congressional duties, what are you doing for fun as a hobby?
Well, I try to see my wife and kids. I mean, my kids are adults now, but my favorite thing in the world is a family vacation. That didn't matter whether they were little tiny kids or older, and you take a little bit of traveling. And then, I don't know, just hang out with friends and do something social.
Awesome.
2020 was particularly hard. It's like, no, these Zoom things are okay, but I need to be around people.
Same. Congressman Davidson, pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.